Good afternoon. I have a great honor, a big one. Pleasure. Honor. Pleasure. I would like to welcome you to this meeting of such an important event, which was organized, I think, at the right time and for the right reasons. We talk a lot about the current situation in the people, but we often forget that what is happening today will not necessarily be repeated, much less developed over the next decades. And we live in a time of qualitative changes in the world and international relations. And there are a lot of things going on that I, at least 10 years ago, simply could not imagine what the world would be like in the 50th year. It's safe to say not like that. It won't be like today. And you can also say with confidence that there will be new players, new rules of the game, new opportunities and new challenges. We are very lucky that today. We are very fortunate. Keynote speaker, we were joined today by Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Sergey Lavrov. A rare person. The minister is a rare person, a gem of a person. And we need headsets on the stage. Can someone arrange for that, please? I am sure it is going to be organized. In my opinion, yes. I think so. We have more here. There is more of us here on the stage. And yet, absolutely. Why would you? Does everyone else know? In my opinion, yes. They have. They have. And the rest of the disciplines have their headsets. I don't need to get interpreted back into Russian or English. The minister is a rare statesman, not only because of his huge experience, with great charisma, incredible diplomatic skill. Incredible skill. Minister. Diplomacy. It turned out. Find. Situation. In fact, he was not just a witness, but also a participant. Architect. A radical change in international relations. If you just think about when the minister found out how. Minister. He was in Russia in the 90s. And where we are. Another Russia, I'm not afraid to say another America. America, another world. And the minister took a direct and very important part in all this. And I have to say that when I think about his historical role, it's hard for me to even imagine what kind of internal restructuring process was expected of you and how you managed to do it. And if someone is now able to predict where we will be in the 50th year, and most importantly, how do we get there correctly? Of course, Minister Lavrov is in a unique position to tell us what and how we are going to see and, moreover, how we need it. Minister, thank you very much. Thank you so much for the word, joining us, and you have the floor. Thank you so much, dear participants. Can I call you? Theory. I'm already used to sitting. I used to see the part panels on the sentences. Panelists, colleagues, friends. Dmitry started. Dmitry's epigraph started with a kind of an epi. When he said that what is happening today, he said that what is going on will never be repeated tomorrow. This is what Kamala Harris wants to say in. But this is life. This is life. Thank you for saying kind words to my address. The question of how a person changes when he takes on sufficiently responsible posts is very, very relevant at the breaking point. On the one hand, it's personal, because I haven't thought about it for a very long time. Now, about that historical one. Of course, in memory and even in sensations, they send those that we then experience. Go deep. Experiences. Then glimmers of hope. And the theme of a multipolar world is just that. In general, it brought to life those glimmers of hope that we saw in the mid-90s. I worked in New York in a 94, in a 96. In January, Yevgeny Maximovich Primakov was appointed Minister of Foreign Affairs, who remains our great teacher, the brightest, multifaceted personality. The gift of political, geopolitical superiority, inherent on this earth, and everyone is fine. And it was he who formulated the revolutionary concept of a faithful world at that time. Proposed the revolutionary concept of a multipolar world, and it was a response to famous political scientists. The end has come. Political scientists, that this is the end of the history, and from now on the world order. It will envelop the whole people, human thoughts, souls, hearts, and everything else. And he did not just put forward this concept, he actively promoted it. And the first concrete step on this path was the declaration on a multipolar world and a formed international order, which was signed by the heads of Russia and China in Moscow back in 1907. And Yevgeny Maximovich was already Prime Minister at that time, Mr. Primakov. But actively influenced prime art, political activity of the government of Boris Yeltsin and the Boris Yeltsin government. It was in 1997. Oh, the foundation of the framework set up for the plurality too. Permanent residence permit. Get into the shape. In the international dialogue. And in the 2002 year. A man. Vladimir Putin became president. Putin held the first trilateral summit of the Party of India summit meeting with Russia and India. Approved. These three countries. A very useful format for all participants. Maybe not as much written as I ask other structures, but a without. Not particularly. Hiding, not hiding, promoted cooperation in this format. About 20, if I'm not mistaken, meetings took place. Bailiff, foreign. Several dozen meetings at their ministerial levels. Dozens of economics, ministers, energy, the meetings. And multipolarity since then, economy has been gaining with all responsibility to speak and analyze. which is based on the concept of analysis by Yevgeny Maximovich Primakov. Confirms relevance, new centers of strength and power, and the center of economic might and industrial power, accompanied by political cloud. Eurasia, we see the emergence of a rural region in the Middle East, Pacific, Latin, Africa, and America. Well, in general, everywhere. And this trend reflects the desire of the countries of each region to take responsibility for their own development, for the development of their parts of the world. And I think this is a very healthy trend, especially since it has taken a new turn and accelerated in the context. And it even got accelerated. The changes that were, in the context of changes, economic and other, election relations to the affairs in the United States. The model, globalized by all six, seemed to be not quite suitable for the philosophy of the Trumpists. It was too ideologized. And they began to purify their actions in the international arena. Ideology. Influences. Ideology. Ideology. That of other ideologies. There were various ideologies. And that was about neoliberal distribution approaches. The neoliberal collective West and the world. There was an attempt to replay and reenact the end of the story, an attempt still at the expense of others, only not the GRU anymore. At the expense of others, of colonial exploitation. Colonialism, but using the methods of neocolonialism. When the countries of the global East and they play the role of a supplier of raw materials, an exception. So if the lion's share added studios. There are many examples of this. The second awakening, if you will, of Africa in particular, where the second awakening of Africa, it is connected precisely with the struggle for refusal. Not about a week of doing business with the West is still being used. Very some methods are encountering rejection by more and more of the East. Last year in December, the group of Friends of the Protection of the Uncharter, there is such a structure that cites defended nations. Counts now 20. The number of applicants. At the initiative of this group of Friends of Protective Charters, a resolution was adopted, which is precisely devoted to the need to counteract the practices of neocolonialism. This autumn of the regular 80th session, the General, this topic will be one of the most acute and serious debates. And of course, this is not just a movement and some conferences, papers that are being discussed. Progress in the process of polarity demonstrates. For example, China is the first today. The economics of the world by politics. Economy number 1 in terms of the purchasing power parity, and Russia is number 4. We'll go lower. I hope that we would not. There are discussions now, bare in all the discus, on microeconomic problems of solving macroeconomics, and about the methods that they use, and Russia, as it was announced last year, has taken Japan and Germany at par. BRICS has bypassed the 7 Western countries entirely by the same indicator for several years now, and the gap between them has increased. At the same time, we do not just see mechanical figures, mechanical economic growth. Everything is achieved through important structural steps. Most of the states, most of them, in one way or another, even maintaining all this understood, normal relations with the West. We were ready to support them. This is not something that has been torn apart, trampled on. But most of the Western countries, after all, they reduce dependence on Western countries, and on Western currencies, in particular. They form uncontrolled Western mechanisms for ensuring the foreign trade fraction, laying, transport, and logistics. Create about cooperation in the field of culture, education, sports. That's the last thing I said. It's also very interesting. It happens in parallel. The United States is now also creating new forms of organizing multilateral global sports competitions. We have a lot of other things, including in the sphere of culture. Eurovision, with everyone. The exotic ornaments and vignettes inherent in it also arouses the desire to like. Human interests. So the process is underway here. And the fact that multipolarity is a geopolitical reality is also recognized in the West. Representatives of the administration. Biden talked. Joe Biden and my colleague Mark, the Russian secretary, in January of the 25th year. The polar world order was an abnormal product at the end of the Cold War. It seemed that the end of the story had come now, since it was decided in the West. Guterres with all his own. Antonio Guterres. Controversial, not very thoughtful statements and topics. He states that this is serious and for a long time, so that they do not apply. Representatives of many European countries have repeatedly painted facts on the world stage in favor of the West. Another thing is that all Western representatives, when they talk about it, admit the fact. They see multipolarity as not the benefit of the principle of equality, fraternity, freedom, and a threat, a challenge to their own interests. Manifestation of equality, brotherhood, and justice, but they see multipolarity as a threat to their long centuries, in general. They ensured their well-being. We don't go to Munich anymore. The conference. In January-February of each year, she created such a structure of the apologist of Western philosophy, the Western school of thought. But recently, this conference in February, it was just dedicated to multipolarity. Multipolaris. They named her. And the report that was released says that they are afraid of multipolarity. They want to. That they are very afraid of multipolarity, and they want to an end. Break it. Hence such a fuck. Lettings resume, therefore they act aggressive. Rigidity up to an ultimatum to a sovereign state, not to violate in any way the unilateral orders that it establishes and tries to establish, including illegal criminal, poger, that undermine the statue of the words that it promoted many decades ago, unilateral restrictions. This thesis, that it is necessary as a report on the Munich conference, described multipolarity, that it is, as I have already said, a challenge, almost synonymous with chaos, confrontation between great powers doomed to permanent rivalry, and, accordingly, creating threats to international security through this rivalry. In other words, the logic, the philosophy of these people who wrote the report is that only at first can provide calm and confident prospects for the development of mankind. And at first it is clear under whom. And any diversity, any multipolarity, is seen as a threat. The threat, of course, first and foremost to those who wanted to ensure the end of history with a unipolar place. It won't work. And this conclusion is doubtful, because the work that is currently going on in the international arena proves the opposite, which is a signal when countries, including great powers, respect their interests. They manage to negotiate. Of course, we have a lot of issues that are called disputes, and that require additional ones. Additional reviews. In return, with our great neighbors and vessels, and with India, and with the CIS countries, the Eurasian Economic Union. The tighter, the closer the cooperation, the more questions arise, on which everyone wants to set aside their interests a little more. But in the end, if you work respectfully, if you do not use threats, ultimatums, and even more so do not apply them in practice, you can always find an honest balance of interests. This is happening, as I have already said, in our relations with China, India, with our neighbors, with the BRICS countries, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, with partners in the Arab world, in the Islamic world as a whole, but also in Africa, in Latin America. But I repeat, the volume of contacts, the volume of joint. We are primarily concentrated in the immediate environment, in structures such as BRICS, SCO, and the Strategic Union. But in order for the world to develop in this way, it is necessary to respect some generally accepted principles. I have heard many colleagues, in the course of various discussions, they predicted that they would have to. The Yalta Potsdam. Yalta Potsdam. But I was watching. For sure. As they say, law enforcement practice. It is not suitable in the form in which the West uses it. But as for the international legal framework, what did not please the UN Charter, which says that the activity, the nation, the sovereign equality of the state, which states that it is impossible to interfere in each other's affairs. There must be wars, the threats of wars must be eliminated. And this is the main goal of the United Nations. Another thing is that it is necessary to apply these principles of the Charter not selectively, as in the menu. You found a cutlet for yourself. A fish. Menu. So they clung to the principle of self-determination of peoples. On the very first page. And through this principle, in a situation when there were no wars, no risks of military confrontation, they tore off Kosovo's heart and said, well, this is an obvious thing, this is the self-determination of peoples. Although there was no referendum, no one was self-determined there, except for the parliament, which was tame and headed. As well as the government, this ministry was headed by criminals from the Kosovo Liberation Army. It was in the 8th year. And when suddenly, in the 2014, a political revolt against the putschists paid in Kiev the power of the coup. For example, the agreement signed the day before, under the guarantee of the European Union with the then president, that it is necessary to hold early elections, and declared themselves the government of the winners. And when the Crimeans, people in the Donbas, rebelled against this and asked to leave them in battle, they were announced politely. The terrorists threw a regular army against them, including warplanes that bombed Lugansk. And much more was going on there. To the shame of the entire West, it has not been investigated. Unsolved crimes, including such iconic ones as the burning of 50 people alive in the house of the trade union. When the Council of Europe timidly tried to offer its services and investigation, he was allowed. And then the Council of Europe received a non-public explanation. Where are his 6? What is his place on this poll? A disgrace. I mentioned the Butch right here. More than 3 years ago, by chance, 2 days after the Russian troops withdrew from the suburbs as a sign of goodwill, before signing the agreements, two days there were only local authorities, and then suddenly, we arrived in Odessa. The BBC was shown not in the basements, but in the central street. The bodies are neatly laid out. Explosion in Taiwan, Russia. Russia. A new package of sanctions. Since then, several of our waiters have been for Prusa structures out with a request to investigate. There they are in the Human Rights Council without our participation. For household matters, you can go there. The silence is deathly. My direct public questions to Guterres at council meetings. Is it possible to get through his kind? Harry Good, and the corpses were told by the mission correspondents, who turned out so well, he leaves. Timely. On the side of the roads were never responded. They were just avoiding eye contact. I was in New York. The Assembly. The last 2 years at. The head of the press conference. There. All the world's media. I already have. Their professional instincts, professional pride. I say, do you really not care what happened there? Or have you been forbidden to touch on this topic? Whether the answer is not firm naturally. Well, I don't want to take up time for an introductory speech for a long time, but there is in the Charter, in addition to territorial integrity, the right of a nation to self-determination. There are many other principles. And by the way, when in 1970, the General Assembly adopted a huge detailed declaration on the principles of relations between the state in accordance with accordance, dotted the TS volume, and with regard to the principle of self-determination. And, as he said, everyone is obliged to respect. Text state, whose governments respect the principle of self-determination of the genera, and, by virtue of this, represent the entire population living at the moment. In other words, the government in a state whose territorial integrity must be protected is obliged to represent the entire population lived after. Who studied after Puig had doubt that the races that came to power, the Nazis, that Russians, Russian-speaking, and political groups that didn't want this criminal power. But the last thing in this very charter of the UN, even before the right of the nation itself, is prescribed not to believe, must be respected. Human rights, independent, race, gender, language. Really? Have you ever heard of Western countries defending Zelensky's government, saying that it is necessary to respect human rights? Not once. Although about what, no matter what country the West does not spread in the public space. Russia, China, Venezuela, Iran, even Hungary, Slovakia. Now, name any country. They have a person somewhere at the very top among the claims. And in Ukraine, there is nothing like that. The words of the Thunderbird, Michel, former head of the council. Well, and all sorts of others. Kaikawasi? Most European leaders say that it is necessary to continue to help Ukraine, Russia. She didn't lose to Russia. Now we need something. Remember, supplies of ammunition. But they all say, Ukraine deserves our support because it protects the European ones. The laws that exterminate the Russian language in all spheres, and the latest laws, in fact, are aimed at the extermination of the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Directly violating the articles I quoted was about, it turns out, the enlightened are perceived by Europe like the struggle of the Russians, Nazis for, Commissioner of the European Union for Expansion, Mrs. Koss, in my opinion. She said that Ukraine has fulfilled all the prerequisites for starting negotiations on its admission to the European Union. This is a quote. That's why the desire, of course, to bury multipolarity and any dissent in general was done with Romania. In Hungary with words, with everyone, those who think about nationality. This is not for the European Union. Multipolarity. This is something else, but it is being formed. It will be formed regardless of how the European leaders behave. I want to end with that. Some time ago, we thought that there are a lot of different integration groups everywhere now, both in Eurasia and in Africa. But in Africa, there are continent-wide African. In Latin America and the Caribbean, there is also a common pool. But not in Eurasia. Although this is the largest and richest, probably the most promising continent for the foreseeable historical perspective. And when we talk about the security of Eurasia, until recently, structures such as the Organizations for Security, Cooperation in Europe, NATO, of course, the European Union immediately came to mind. And they tried to play the role of an honest broker and pulling neighbors from the Asian part of the European continent to their mechanisms. But both the OSCE and NATO were created on the basis of the Euro-Atlantic concept.
but OSCE and NATO were created on the basis of the Euro-Atlantic.
Even when the summit was convened in Helsinki, when it was being prepared in 1975 year. And then it was assumed that it would be Europe to the west of the Urals and up to Lisbon. But the Europeans insisted on inviting the USA and Canada. And this Euro-Atlantic model, of course, harms itself. This applies not only to the OSCE, but also to NATO as another product of Euro-Atlantic concepts. This also applies, now it is probably safe to say, to the European Union, which was engaged in the economic, social, infrastructural development of the territory of the member countries, and ensured the connectivity of the territory with this. And a couple of years ago, in the midst of a special military operation, having accumulated, even, probably, without accumulating, it was accumulated there for a long time, throwing hatred towards Russia into his hands, reviving Nazi aggressive ideas about inflicting strategic defeat on Russia, substituting the whole of Europe. Strategically, Napoleon in the Crimean War. The first one, especially. Of course, the Second World War. The veil of all the people who believed in it fell from their eyes. And the European Union did not sign with NATO, with which it provided its territory for any transfer of any weapons to the east, to the borders of the Russian Federation. So he also fell into Euro-Atlanticism. But the main thing is that these structures can no longer pretend to partially fill some kind of vacuum of a continent-wide forum. Because the ABS is destroyed. Almost too. The consensus has been trampled on with Finland. Who is the chairman, who is preparing the Jubilee 50th session of the Council of Ministers? Not everyone calls Anastanos. Just like that. They didn't spoil it. A holiday. NATO is in the deepest crisis. Let's see how to reform 5%. There's cheese there now. Boron? How they will check. Let's see how. This is influenced by the obvious. The desire in Washington for the Trump administration to do more. The Far Eastern Dunes and the Pacific region, as they call the Asian region. And leaving Europe, the French say tuition device. Please sort out your own affairs yourself. In this regard, of course, a continental-wide one is being asked. After all, we had relations with the European Union. Dozens. Mechanisms. The Council of Russia on the ground. There was also a lot of program, the fight against terrorism, and whatnot there. And Afghanistan. Cooperation on Afghanistan. No, not yet. Afghanistan. At one time, when the first Russia summit was held, Putin proposed not to create something there, but to go from life. There is a Eurasian one. The Eurasian Economic Union has relations with Shanghai. Each of these organizations has relations with ASEAN, with the tourist state of the East. There are relations between the Eurasian Union and projects within the framework of the Chinese one. Belt and Road concepts. And all this, if you just bring together those who are planning in each of these areas, and see where these plans can be usefully harmonized. And this is the process the President called the formation of a large Eurasian partnership.
И вот этот процесс президент назвал формированием большого евразийского партнерства.
Not only the structures that I have listed, there is also the Cooperation Council for the Arab States of the Persian Gulf, with which we have very close relations. There is also the South Asian Development Council. There is the Central Asian Five.
Есть Центральноазиатская пятерка.
Well, and a whole series of others. Structures. Therefore, this is a great Eurasian partnership. We offer openness to all countries of the continent without exception. The continent that, located on it by the state, gives huge competitive advantages. Countries. Allo. Flicker AB what didn't work out. Probably, the Americans did not restore the northern streams. I said that the northern streams fall under sanctions. It is forbidden to restore them. And he also cries that they do not suffer. Well done. But this great Eurasian partnership, if it develops naturally, it may well become a material foundation for the architecture of Eurasian security. We are currently doing this, first of all with our Belarusian friends, who are ready to hold the third conference on Eurasian security. Today or tomorrow, my colleague, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Belarus, will be here in Moscow on a visit. He and I have circulated as an initiative for discussion the draft Eurasian Charter of Multipolarity and Diversity. The process is of interest. Representatives of NATO countries, the European Union, as well as Serbia, participated in the Minsk conferences. Serbia. Hidden for all processes. The process is for the countries located in Eurasia, and last. The ruling United Russia Party held political hearings in Perm a week ago on the participation of the party leaders, and it was attended by the leaders of the parties, including Asia, Japan, including from Japan, from South Korea, from Thailand, and the People's Republic of the Republic, the parties that are part of the International Alliance, the International Asian. In general, the Alliance of Asian Political. Here, I must have had too much, right? I'll have a question regarding the administration. Very soon. It is yours. What are you looking for? What are you looking for? Very soon. For almost 5 months now. A lot has been done during this time. There were many appointments, some called appointments ended with a review, dismissals, and so on. Dismiss. How do you see Russia's attitude? How do you see the relations between Russia and the Donald Trumps, where we are and where we are heading to? I think that we are in a more correct position and normally, rather than this, in I used to be administration, when we had to deal with Joe Biden's and not after a helpful summit meeting between President Putin and Joe Biden in Geneva in 23. Unfortunately, not by 360. Unfortunately didn't make a turn 300 degrees as it was the same. Actually made just a U-turn, 180 degrees, and cut all the communication channels. And probably I will not spill any bin if I say that when we were in a limited group in 2021, Joe Biden, without looking into his notes or reading from paper, would say that both the United States and Russia, two great powers, that every power has its own history. We have to respect the history of each other and of any other country as well. That the United States was set up as a melting pot, with all the migrants being plunged into and come out of the melting pots, with a stamp of human rights on their forts. And then he continued, your empire developed differently. It would incorporate new territories. Settled peoples have lived for centuries. That was home for many centuries for the peoples that already settled down, and you didn't put all those peoples into any melting. You would keep with a lot of respect to all their traditions and rights, would value their culture, the history, their religions. And even the Russian Empire had such a practice of. Assigning different status to its different components and regions in order to respect that diversity. That's why Joe Biden continued in June 2021. This is a totally different state, entity that says civilization. In the senses, in various meanings of that word. And we, as he told President Putin, do not want solidity. Anyone undermine that monolith, that entity. You have to do a lot. Once you came to power in early 2000 and the country became stronger. And we believe this is very much useful because having a nuclear bomb. Well, actually, we feel more comfortable and easier once you control the nuclear bomb. And this is the President Lula. Brazil, quite recently. Joe Biden being in the office in the White House. Destroy it. President said that we have to destroy Russia, and this looks like the main was that lost. Doesn't lose the ability to control its military might. Since his main concern was to destroy Russia, at least as President Lula. What it is now. And then there was the cliff. The director came running. The director, the head arrived and tried to talk us out. As they thought, it was already. As they thought the final decision was to attack Ukraine. A remarkable intent to invade Ukraine, and said that we are not interested in invading anyone. But we are protecting our legitimate security interests. And if you remember, this is where the draft agreement Russian and the draft treaty Russian were presented, where our interests were identified and enshrined. Russia's security interests not in detriment, not an expense of our neighbors. A couple of meetings were held on one document, on the other document. And in January, we met the then State Security in Geneva discussing about documents. And in essence, we were ignored. And the tasks that were proposed and the tasks that we are addressing the framework of the special operation now were called unacceptable. Garan. No guarantees of Ukraine acceding to NATO, non-acceding to NATO were given. We were done to think about this. State Secretary Blinken said that. He said that we are creating medium-range ground-based missiles. Creating, which was prohibited by the contract. INF missiles that were prohibited under the INF Treaty. The Americans did not respond to call to our appeal to make a simultaneous moratorium, not connected with each other. And Anton Blinken said, "Let us agree that in Ukraine we are going to deploy such land-based intermediate and short-range missile INS. No more than that. And then you, next to the Ukrainian border, may commit yourselves not to deploy more than certain numbers, putting certain cap on the number of the INF missile." And a couple of weeks ago, speaking in Munich were in doubles, probably in Munich. Zelensky hysterically was shouting that no one would prohibit Ukraine to enter the NATO, then later, in the total detriment of the Minsk Corps, Donbass was shelled, and shelling became dozens of times more intensive. The B plan was brought into life. Not to use the Minsk Accords to put an end to that war, but they supposed to seize quite little territory, very little territories of Luhansk, Antonisk, people's republics that were out of control of Kiev, and we didn't have any choice. I know that I have only 5 minutes left to answer that question. And the last thing that I want to say, and that what actually characterizes the incumbent US administration, is that we should not have any wishful thinkings. When I met Marco Rubio in Ariad in late February, they, as the initiator of the meeting, are Americans. As the initiatives of that meeting, conversation, they started the conversation and the following. President Trump's foreign policy. Donald Trump, the foreign policy of the rests on the national interests. And this is what we spoke, and he said we recognize that other countries do as well, especially when it comes to great powers, when we are the United States. Therefore, so that there are no surprises, so that there are no misunderstandings, we proceed from the fact that, in most cases, large countries will not have interests. Countries will not have coinciding the national interests of such countries. But when the national interests of such countries in the United States and Russia coincide, not a crime, but there will be a colossal response. Don't use this match in order to implement mutually beneficial projects in the material sphere, be it economy, energy, post. But in the majority of cases when these interests do not coincide, it is the duty of the great powers not to allow this non-coincidence to degrade in confrontation all the more hotly, to prevent supports with his hands. The president went down exactly. Confrontation. I can only subscribe to that, and President Putin. Proceed. Honestly. The national does not arrive to have an open conversation with anyone, but without sacrificing our core interests, and we are not requiring from our partners compromise. We can always set an agreement. We can actually balance our interests and make a compromise. And President Putin said that more than once. Answer a question as to how has it happened, whether you can agree on something. We do not know how Donald Trump's administration would. I believe that fear in the future, which have been established. I think that the relations that were established between the presidents during Donald Trump's first are quite working one. Both presidents do not need any introductory words, and in the course of regular phone conversations, they immediately proceed with speaking about business. And I do think that this is the way that we have to. You would rather outline your position openly and frankly. Then there will be no false expectations and no full thinking. I think that President Trump and his state secretary and his vice president are politicians like that who are working that. Thank you. Thank you so much. And now we are proceeding with to other participants in that meeting that we really don't have much time, and we are very short of time. Thank you so much for your excellence. And I would appreciate if the question, Larry is known. This, Larry Johnson, military political, Chi and department analyst, Larry. And I know Larry for many years. When the Bush administration decided to invade, George W. decided to in Iraq, the policies of the neoconservatives can lead to serious problems. I am very glad to welcome you. Your question. What is your question? Minister Lavrov, it is good to be with you again, albeit in a less intimate setting. Simple question for you. Unlike the United States, which does not integrate its diplomatic and military policies, Russia has always been a leader in terms of coordinating both diplomatic and military efforts. What problems or obstacles or challenges do you envision as Russia now shifts from a special military operation to counterterrorism? Yes, of course we care. And not only because of what happened over the past week with so much at the beginning, but also because these methods in one form or another, not in such a naked way as it was done in the Bryansk and Kursk regions, these methods have the Kiev regime presence. Kiev mode. You can list any territory where there is fighting, and the result will be the same. I'm counting. The most striking example is chickens. Well, for example, our armed forces, they then explain what objects they struck. On the territory of Ukraine, objects associated with the armed forces, military units themselves, places of offensive equipment, and so on. Or objects that were civilian, using them by the armed forces. In the Kursk region, not everyone saw it. What did the Ukrainian Nazis see there? There is not a single object that could be presented to the viewer as an object related to the fighting. Therefore, this is not particularly surprising for us. And the president is meeting with something. Very. He clearly said what conclusion we came to. We come, and we will proceed from this. But you are absolutely right. The threat is quite serious. And it is obvious that everything is being done correctly. Country, but the Ukrainian. I wanted to say, Anglo-Saxon. Anglo-Saxon. Support of the British. Support of the British. Who knows, it may be there by inertia. And that the US participated. The British. 100%. And, of course, appropriate measures are needed not only through the Federal Security Service, a huge amount of work is being done. Not only through the Ministry of Internal Affairs, Rosgvardia, and Special Services. And, of course, what we used to call increased vigilance is very important. We have to raise public awareness to keep on alert. And they are doing it. But you are absolutely right. There are risks of an increase in the terrorist threat, as it seems, and we will do everything. They were escalates, and we see those risks, and we'll do all our best to mitigate that, not to do any harm to our citizens. Thank you. Next question. The next question is coming from the Chinese. Wei, University, Professor of Fu, University in China. Thank you for the Minister Lavrov for your inspiring speech. My question is, Russia is designated as a civilizational state in its 2023 foreign policy concept paper, which underscores its identity as anchored in Eurasian civilizational traditions, distinct from Western liberalism. What will be the implication of this identification, emphasizing cultural and civilizational sovereignty? Impact Russia's long-term relationship with Europe, the United States. And furthermore, civilizational states like Russia and China are increasingly major architects of multipolarity. With their civilizational legitimacy, especially their belief in moving beyond the Western logic of divide and rule, zero-sum gain, to embrace win-win cooperation. What do you think of the prospect of a kind of synergy and between the Chinese proposal like by Belt and Road Initiative and Russia's Eurasian Economic Union? And to extent, it had great impact for the region and beyond, especially you mentioned just now. A kind of overarching institution for the whole region, maybe China, Russia as this huge civilizational states, thank you. But the Eurasian continent, it is unique in that it is located here and has developed for thousands of years. Created not only two civilizations, much more.
The Eurasian continent is unique because here, for millennia,
there is also an Indian civilization. There is the Ottoman civilization. There are, of course, civilizations that were called at one time the Roman Empire, and some echoes of those traditions also remain. On other continents, neither in Africa nor in Latin America, there are civilizational ones there. Roots. First of all, indigenous peoples, but not so outlined in the civilizational symbols of culture, traditions, customs. Even the Greenlanders. And we have several civilizations. And in my introductory speech, I tried to convey the idea that, of course, people are all different, civilizations are all different. Different characters. Religions are different. But in Eurasia, at least, we can find a common language with all our neighbors, with all the major powers. And I completely agree with you. It is through the dialogue of civilization that this process can acquire a continental one. Why? And I also agree with you that Russia and the People's Republic of China can and probably should play a leading initiative role in such a continent-wide process.
ведущую инициативную роль вот в таком общеконтинентальном процессе.
And as a first step, I really hope that we will be able to restore the work of the Troika of Russia, India, and China, BRIC. For the last couple of years, we did not meet at the level of foreign ministers, but I am also discussing this topic with my Chinese counterpart, the Indian Foreign Minister. I really hope that now, after the tension has subsided, in my opinion, significantly, and the borders between India and China, and the situation is stabilizing, there is a dialogue between Delhi and Beijing. We will be able to resume the work of such a troika, Russia, India, China, during the period of promoting the common outline. Very important step forward towards promoting and continental processes. Next question. Mr. Earl Musk, a politician and businessman. It's not just a coincidence. This is not just a coincidence that his last name is the same. He is the father of Mr. Moscow that we know so much about and heard so much about. Please.
Listened with great interest to Minister Lavrov, so well explained. What I see today is the world is in a terrible state of flux. The countries around the world do not trust their governments in almost every case, and they have a lot of good reason for not trusting their governments. And last year, I had the opportunity in 2024 of traveling through the United States. And I can tell you that at that time, under the Biden administration, the country was in a state of, the people were in a state of shock, not knowing what lies ahead for them as this administration under this man, this, in my opinion, not a very good man, was doing to the country. And I have a lot of my family there, and they were asking, where are we going to go? We can't go anywhere else now. We came to America because this was going to be the place we could get away from all the terrible things that are happening around the world. And now it's coming to the United States. And by God's grace, in my opinion, Donald Trump was elected to be president at the end of last year with the help of my family. And everything changed. Everything changed. Everybody started smiling. I went to America, everybody was relieved. Everybody was breathing properly. I spent April this year in America. I like to tell people that, I like to think I should say to people that 80% of the population that I met from California to Texas last month in April was behind Trump, is behind Trump, 80%. That's not true. 100% behind Trump, 100% behind Trump. Trump talks about sovereignty for the United States. I believe you only come right when your country's sovereignty is established. I like the idea of multipolarity and all that sort of stuff, but first your own country, and then relations with each other. That works. Coming to Russia for the first time myself, I need to tell you, and I think many people here don't know this, but when you grow up in the West, you are taught from a very early age that Russia is a terrible place where you have to duck around dark shadows for fear of people killing you or stabbing you. You cannot live there under normal circumstances. You will be put in front of a firing squad if you do anything that they don't like. This is wrong. This is so wrong. I arrived here. I was going to come with my daughter, Alexandra. She's 32 years old now, and she's very close to me. But anyway, she was going to come on this trip. She joined me on a trip to India. And as we were about to leave, as it happened, Dubai for Moscow, she received instructions from my sons: do not go to Russia under any circumstances. And then I received messages from other people around Europe: do not go to Russia. Why? I said, why? Why must I not go to Russia? What is it? What am I supposed to be frightened of? You know, and I won't say they couldn't tell me, they sort of intimated that my life is at risk if I come to Russia. And well, you know, I arrived here and the first thing I saw was perfect, total civilization in every direction. I see a city that easily rivals ancient Rome, and probably, I made the comment to somebody earlier, is by far, not by a little, but by far, the premier capital city in the world. And I don't say that lightly. I mean, you know, I'm a critical person. Yeah, so I would like to say to Minister Lavrov that I've always enjoyed watching him on the television. He always has something quite witty to say. And so I've always enjoyed watching him on television. He always seems to come out the winner. And so what I'd like to sort of suggest to him is, how can we change the perception of the West about Russia? Because I think this is probably, if not the finest, one of the finest communities in the world that I've seen.
You know, thank you. Thank you very much for your kind words. I think it's the most beautiful society group, the greatest community, a group of people. There are different ways to describe it. Many Russians, many representatives of other peoples from the Soviet Union, the happiest moment of my life was, well, you know, such a figurative meeting on the Elbe. When the terrible enemy was dispersed, when in spite of all those diplomatic maneuvers, against the diplomatic, from the West in the early days, part of the West during the first months and years of the, yes, assistance. The main thing is that you expected, especially Britain, when and on whose side to join. And of course, it accumulated. There was still distrust, but thanks to several meetings at the top, Russian, Americana, between the leaders of the United States, succeeded, work it out. Of the yuck, they were able to. A geopolitical compromise. Develop a geopolitical compromise at the top level. There was also a cold calculation. Of course, that was based upon balance of interest. The balance of interest. But here I have not seen anything more embodying happiness than the footage of a chronicle, a meeting. That's all you know. The troops and meeting. Undermined, by and large, that the Second War has not yet ended. Our allies were preparing the unthinkable on the initiative of the British. But they understood that the attack of the Soviet Union, that's what they were doing, preparing for this fall. That these are not thoughts. Nevertheless, the direction of thought. It was. And then the Bolton speech. And the Cold War, and the Cold Curtain. Therefore, the happiest community of people. This will never happen in the world. People from different countries, but who have the same feelings. Defeating evil, that's probably the most important thing. Now it is also about the struggle of consciousness. And absolutely right. When you say that the West, first of all, is now Europe. And not all of the Europe, by the way. This, the core is aggressive with flickers, macros. They just want, in addition to the fact that they are fighting against us, supplying Ukraine with high-precision, high-tech weapons that Ukrainians cannot control. It means that the citizens of the countries that make up these weapons are in charge. They also want to demonstrate the isolation of our country, forbidding everyone to come here. Some MEP has arrived. Celebration. 80 years old. Celebration of anniversary of the victory. You're going nowhere. To the meeting, but this. Let me. Was allowed to go somewhere. A shame. Fascism, dict. What has been done to Romania? In it mentioned that, and there will be other cases. One interesting aspect. Now, aspect came to my. All of these countries have ambassadors. Some of them also have consulates general in St. Petersburg and in some other cities. And, of course, the ambassador's job is to convey the truth to his government. The government has declared its goal to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia. The donkeys are obliged to report on how this task is being solved on Earth, that is, on the territory of the Russian Federation, against which a war to defeat has been declared. I do not know what the ambassadors are reporting, but we can tell you about something. Well, first of all, this is my only example. A year ago, in May 2024 year, we just thought in our ministry and decided not to reciprocate rudely. But the procedures that were introduced to the countries of Gleb in relation to our ambassadors in Europe. They simply did not accept them, with the rarest exceptions, when it is possible to express some protests of anger. And we had practiced before the start of a special military operation. We met with all the ambassadors twice a year. On our platform they have. And we'll leave lunch to the workers all in a row. Because we decided to invite them. In May of the 24th. And just to ask. So, without an announcement, it doesn't matter anymore. What is not clear to them from what is happening? That clearly the capitals of these countries did not show awareness of what was happening and what the result of aggression against Russia was. And what effect did it have? Produces on Russian. The manual. On. Society. Everyone was invited, including the head of the EU delegation. This time was set in a few days. Events, the answer comes from them that they are. They were instructed to refuse this invitation from their capitals. In other words, Europe didn't care what the result was at that time from its completely belligerent, aggressive one.
воинственной, агрессивной
politics,
политики.
and they forbade the ambassadors. I mentioned this publicly. After that, you became aware that they were going to the representative of the European Commission and decided to respond to my public criticism, decided to write a paper, which they then published, and in it, in the draft that they distributed, it was said that this was not so. They didn't accept the invitation because they can't accept an invitation from the foreign minister of a country that attacked Ukraine. There's something else, and that poisoned Navalny.
Они не приняли приглашение, потому что они не могут принять приглашение от министра иностранных дел страны, которая напала на Украину, там еще чего-то, и которая отравила Навального.
And in this regard, I remind you, just as we can't achieve anything by the names of those whose bodies were shown in the city of Buch, neither. To Russia, there is no one commissioner for human rights, neither. From journalists who always seem to know about Epstein, it does not work out about Buchaya in any way. But about Navalny. I believe that this is also blasphemy, speculation of a person's life. He was not treated. Because when Navalny during the day, instantly, without registration of any necessary documents there, then it is necessary to issue in such cases. During the day, people were sent from Omsk to Germany by plane, on which people arrived without visas, without passports, and people without visas flew away. When he was brought to the hospital, Shellite, in my opinion, in a civilian hospital, nothing was found, but they were immediately transported to the Bundeswehr clinic, and they found it there. We wrote a note. Then they discovered something, and at the same moment, we said that we didn't discover anything, and the alien hospital didn't see anything. Can we get familiar with the documents? They said, now, if we disclose Navalny's analysis, where our biological program is located. Wow. Therefore, we will give all these analyses to the organization. We're going there. Organizations for Prohibition. Prohibition of chemical weapon privatized, says the Germans gave it to us, they told you not to help. Weed to Thepwenter. Where are the documents? And the Germans didn't. Therefore, kidding. How was he treated? What's in there for him? Navalny was treated, and what he was at. How? Military hospital. They could manifest themselves in a year, 2, 1.5, 3, I don't know either. Have any side effects. Again, it is based on a refusal to provide facts. Remind you that we were denied just like MH17. No one present. 13 witness. All the others, one was in and others were in absentia, anonymous. The United States recently provided satellite images. They were shown to the court. Maybe not satellite data. They didn't do that, but the court trusts the United States that the evidence. This is a manifestation of the same. This is another manifestation of the very impunity. Irreparable self-righteousness serves as the main engine of the technique to pick. Literally, including and multipolarity. But it seems to me that, well, that's exactly what I want to say, the truth is on our side. To say that the truth, multipolar, follow us, multipolarity would be ours. Thank you so much. Next question. George Galloway, a very well-known British politician, journalist and a person who is known for having no fear. Excellence, I am half Scottish and half Irish, so I would like to take this opportunity to disavow any responsibility for the historic crimes of the Anglo-Saxons.
Any responsibility for the historic crimes of the Anglo-Saxons.
President Trump is in office, but is he in power? In the last dizzying days in Washington, we have seen the ability of President Trump to do a Baerbock and Anna Baerbock. 360 degrees, 180 degrees. He turns hourly, daily. Might this be merely a feature of his personality? Or might it be this excellency that a state of dual power exists in the United States? That the president's bona fides are one thing. And personally, I believe that he knew nothing of the terrorist attacks on the Air Force bases in Russia over the last week. But his operatives clearly did. They were clearly operating to the orders of the last administration. I wonder if you think there are some grounds for believing that the deep state in the United States is determined to frustrate any good that President Trump might have in mind. But I think that in any society, especially in any society, in a society that, especially in the society that for many decades would develop within its political system using a beaten track, the arrival of the bright, non-standard, a kind of maverick, the leadership of the state, of a comes to power, causes, who doesn't fit the common standards, that would cause some hidden processes aimed at restoring the lifestyle you are used to. I mean the public debt and the public spending to be the same and to spread the ideology. I do think that this is typical for all countries, not only the United States. And over the last couple of years, we said more than one. There were already people who really hoped that, in that society, return to your circles. We had people who want to get back to the previous circles. Escaped, I mean Western. Escaped from Russia would return them in the international business, and so they would be very much welcome. The people would be able to go to differential luxury international resorts. Life will be adjusted. And that the life, consumption, would be just as usual, when the consumption in its through import would bed, the president said, President Putin, about our people, who call them not the deep state. Roughly the meaning is the same. And, of course, we have a union of this kind of characters that is not as strong as in the United States. But you do not have a group of people in Russia. But President Putin quite recently was speaking about the return of business. He said that we are not against, but let's do that in honest. So once we are flat, and you left your employees unattended, the niche is on, and we will admit only those who are interested in and after the beginning of the special military. Let's speaking about the future of the world. Never. For Russia, for the Russian, it will not be the same as it was before February 2002 years. In other words, I hope to the last that those draft treaties of Russia and NATO, Russia and the United States, which in the 21st year passed in their numbers, that they would still be taken seriously.
Russia, NATO, and Russia, the United States, the copies of which we hand it over to our counterparts.
And that common sense prevail.
Would be received with seriousness and
It didn't work out. They didn't believe us.
But no,
Well, most recently, in an interview, they didn't believe in what we were. And quite recently, to a direct question, answering director, he said, yes, I was in the kitchen. Whether you were naive, President Putin. First of all, it means that when we were entwined with so many friendly formats and friendly ones from the Pacific,
when we were bound with so many friendly slogans and friendly
the ocean of space, networks and formats, when we let it be common,
we were told that
economy, territory from Lisbon to infrastructure, guitar questions, common space,
actually there would be a lot of common spaces
to the quiet one, S,
the sphere of
dozens of areas of joint projects,
and
annually, annual
summit meetings
meetings, ministers of corrections met,
of
the minister,
ministers,
the Council of Russia,
the
Russia, NATO Russia Council,
NATO Russia
at the highest level subscribed, and a different statement between the security is indivisible and strengthen security, and no one.
the security is indivisible and
All this, of course, accumulates by inertia. And every time the West proved its complete incompetence, when it proved that all these beautiful words were for only one purpose, to prepare again for a war with Russia for destruction, as they did.
for one thing, to get prepared for a war against Russia until it is destroyed.
But I didn't want to believe it, and to the last. And we want to believe in that. And until the last moment we, Germany, France,
Tried to avoid that.
there were contacts with London.
Our contacts with
We tried to promote the idea that the guys, we
also kept in touch with London and
they are breaking off these agreements bit by bit like this.
give it a try. And
Then she confessed. Break piece by piece, and as Victoria later on admitted, 5 billion. They invested 5 billion twice in Ukraine in order to make it Russian.
to make it anti-Russia.
And apologize. Me. I'm sorry that the agenda is from the American agenda, but in the European Commission.
Again, that situation is not unique for the United States.
The European Commission elected Never Voice, which is the subject of such underhanded bargaining. And about you, the characters in this commission.
Subject matter of bargain.
Now,
So this is quid pro quo, and look at who
they
are
play
the
their
players.
game the way the deep state does.
They are playing their game
And they
just
want to
like
raise this deep state. As soon as a non-nomenclatura person wins the first round of elections in some country,
soon as not the mainstream
in a good
politician,
sense,
the first
a
round of
nationalist,
elections,
he may not like it, but he thinks about his people. This would be a person who doesn't love them, and this is a duty of any politician.
this is a duty of any
Immediately deep state mechanisms would be triggered, and this return back to it used to be.
would return back to
So I sincerely hoped, what? Constitutional norms will prevail in America.
constitutional norms.
The president,
prevail in the United States, that President
he will
Trump
not be constrained in the exercise of his powers,
would not be restricted within his constitution.
and that he will receive the entire volume of information. I do not know how things are with informing the president about those operations that
Full information. I do not know what
Ukrainian regime,
and
to what extent he has been worried about the crimes committed by the Ukrainian,
committed by the Ukrainian regime.
American. Suddenly, we know that the Security Office of Ukraine has a lot of.
Ukraine has a lot of
They work, the instructor, intelligence of other states, which supply the Ukrainian regime with weapons, the instructor, This is also a fact. The fact that they are advising the Ukrainian armed forces. Strategies. Just right. When placing objects, when masking objects. We know that too. And I have already mentioned that a number of modern weapons are used without the direct participation of military personnel. Impossible. President Trump was asked on the plane how. Me. What does he think about? The latest attacks, terrorist attacks, terrorist attacks. He said that when he heard about it. And he said that when I immediately realized that Ukrainians would get the Ukrainians and their bombing price for that, and they would be bombed too. I can only perceive and comment on what I hear. That would bomb the hell out of them. At least this is what I heard. As informing the president. I do not know. How the special services are informing President Trump, I do not know. Because we, as the Russia's foreign ministry, we do not meddle in other countries. Aris. Thank you so much. And our question from John Shipman, a well-known Australian anti-war activist and architect, and best known as the father of Julian. As apart from his personal merits. Your Excellency, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
In the gathering twilight of a singularity, stars and constellations appear, bringing to us the gifts of wonder and thoughtfulness. What in the circumstances of multicultural, multipolar, or multi-world circumstances in future of diplomacy?
What are the circumstances and future of diplomacy?
You know, I believe that diplomacy is in any systems, in any diplomacy, in the formats of the world order, where it will not disappear, persist. Diplomas. I already said that diplomacy, this is the most ancient professional. Because you have to agree on everything else. Without diplomacy, you cannot do that. And some time ago, again, speaking about the naive perception of that rosy honeymoon period after the collapse of the USSR, when we were wined and dined by international specialists who incorporated in our political financial structures.
International specialists who incorporated into our political financial structures.
Well, we really believe that it would be the end of history, and now we are part of that civilized world. While disappointment occurred very soon. At that period of time, foreign policy language, our foreign policy lingua, had such a formula that you could find in different documents that this is a new epoch, post-Soviet, post-Cold War. Epoch. And it is characterized by decreasing the role of fools in the international affairs. You can only laugh at that nowadays. Persuaded to reduce the power factor. Persuaded. This factor is involved. Decrease the role of force immediately. Naive. All those promises. Subjected an attack. It can't be. Cannot be such. Diplomacy is all the same, in particular, to prevent uncontrolled, at least in order to avoid, the exit of the arms race to the level when nuclear. The irreparable can happen, especially now it adds a serious risk of artificial intelligence. Who? artificial intelligence, do not know what the may for itself. How is the management of this or that country organized? And this is now. Undermine the governance, for instance. There is a desire in the Trump administration to resume a strategic dialogue. Administration, us, intend to resume the strategic dialogue, and we proceed from the fact that as the basics, sorry for the tautology, the basic components of our mice, which they will be brought, in accordance with the principles of conducting peer-to-peer.
Basic components of our relations are brought in compliance with
the principles of strategic stability. Negotiations on strategic stability. We will do that, but more efforts have to be applied. 2. When diplomacy is still needed. Diplomacy. Situations. Now the best diplomats. Absolutely. Fighters.
are the fighters
On the line of contact.
our fighters on the front line.
They win back the truth, honor, and dignity of people. Recently so Merz went into a frenzy in one of his speeches, said that Russia need to stop. We again make Germany military force in Europe. I do not know if he understood what the word again means in this context. Russia will not stop in Ukraine and will conquer. It will not stop and will conquer the whole of Europe. He judges by himself. He still has the mentality of Hitler's Germany, which needed territories to gain access to natural resources. And most people have certain ethnic norms and forms. They were just going to destroy and destroy. He tries to think about us based on these genetic, instinctive relationships of his. We're not outside the territory. We are conducting this special military for the people whose ancestors, for centuries they lived on these islands, created cities there, built ports, factories, roads, sowed wheat. Other products were produced. And it was these people who were declared inhumans as the first leaders who came after the coup in 2014 did. Beings, as Zelensky did in September 2021 year. Answering the question, that's what he thinks about the people on the other side. In the Donbass, he said there are people and there are creatures. If you live in Ukraine and think that you belong to Russian culture, my advice is for the safety and happiness of children and grandchildren. For the happiness of your children. As a matter of fact, go to Russia. The referendum. Conduct Russia room. That's what it's about. That's what it's about. And when? In the Russian city of Odessa. Odessa. Monument to Catherine. Monument. The founder of the city, actress Catherine. The Kiev Nazi regime, ignoring the protests of citizens, demolishes. And a week later, UNESCO declares the historical part of Odessa, where this monument stood, a world cultural heritage. What are we talking about now? Think. FAR, which is headed by a French citizen. How can you disgrace yourself like that, and how can you make it so that no one in the West even mentions it? Although the fact is absolutely obvious. That is why we have now held talks in Istanbul.
Проводили переговоры в Стамбуле.
Our operation will continue.
Будет продолжаться.
The President has clearly explained. But, at the same time, we are ready to contribute to classical diplomacy in achieving the goals of a military operation, primarily in solving humanitarian problems.
Прежде всего в решении гуманитарных
Prisoners. The return of the young, forgotten through these shopping centers or whatever they are called. The guys on the Ukrainian side of the wounded, sick, and about Zelensky's refusal to take away from you.
отказ Зеленского забрать
Refusal Zelensky to take the bodies of Ukrainian soldiers. I mean, that has been discussed so much, I don't want to return to that negative.
еще раз. Когда-то
And, at some point, the results achieved on the ground will be embodied.
все равно оформляться
Legally,
юридически.
illegal, document. This will be done, first of all, of course together with the military fight by the diplomats. And our position is clear. For what? We know what we are fighting. And they're directly at the front. Over there on the front line. On diplomatic, economy. Diplomatic and the economic. Direction. And also it comes to raising children.
Воспитание наших детей.
where it comes to raising our children.
One last question. The last question. The last one. This question is valid.
We would want it to be as short as possible.
We are very glad to welcome you. Foreign Affairs, Austria, Professor of St. Petersburg, University, Petsburg.
M. Pleasure to be here, to be with Minister Lavrov again. I know that your heart beats for the United Nations, for international organizations. They're where you started your diplomatic life. My question is, what is the geographic status of international organizations that currently, if I may say, are still located in so-called neutral countries such as Switzerland and Austria, but which have abandoned the neutrality over the last 3 years? Do you think that this multipolar world requires a relocation? I am thinking, for instance, of OPEC, oil-producing organization of all producing countries, to move, let us say, to Istanbul. It is just an idea. Or certain union organizations located in Geneva to go to India, to the African continent, because with all these changes, I think we also will see a new mirror of these international organizations.
Thank you.
Спасибо. Я
Thank you very much. You see, it's best to translate to.
лучше всего ООН перевести
It's best to move the United Nations Sochi, 100 the south of Russia.
Sochi in the south of Russia.
Stalin, by the way, suggested it. Stalin suggests that in Urn. But then he went to meet me. But then, first, then to New York. Roosevelt, and then it was Long Island first, and Manhattan was destination. But at this point in time, all these structures
глубоко пустили
have really rooted, have
причем
Really taken root.
physical buildings in the form of a person,
Physical assets as buildings, as property, but also
especially after the permanent contacts of the staff were introduced.
постоянные
after
контракты.
permanent contracts were in
I bought it for myself.
the personnel
Apartments themselves.
themselves.
If now, translate, and if you relocate them, such a move, that will be a. It's scary to imagine. Great movement for peoples. It is hard to imagine. I think that in this case we have with the same principle.
С тем же принципом
We have to use the same principle as we use when we
United Nations.
United Nations Charter. There is not a single
It would
principle
not be relevant today, which would be unfair.
несправедлив.
pertinent today that would not
And the only drawback,
Единственным недостатком
the only
it would be suggested that it is not being executed.
those
as we used to say in the Russian Empire. In the Russian Empire, Russian laws are cruel, Russian laws are strict, but this is softened by the fact that they are not followed. That's it with the Charter of FR. And the same happens with the United. And it's the same with the countries that. And the same goes for the countries that. In the most central one, headquarters of organizations are located in Austria and Switzerland. If you comply with the UN Charter, if the United Nations, that's right, all the world's problems. There is much more than one principle. Follow the principle of sovereign quality of nations. Just follow it. It's hard to be considered realistic, but still. And the same goes to the relocation. Every capital where the union structures are located. In the agreement between this organization, these obligations, it is pointless to demand to delay the issuance of visas, and even more so it is not necessary to delay a week. They demand not to restrict the movements of diplomats who work in the representative offices of international organizations. Therefore, a committee was created in New York by a decision with the country. Even in the administration, during the administration, the organization that we still went to even during the administration, and we managed to include by the hosts, that the United States as the host country should perform its functions. It won't even matter so much, because it will be cheaper than moving. But it is important from the principle that you don't want to put up with the fact that obligations were once written down in the crudest way. Violate. Rightness is on the side of the one who demands the fulfillment of the agreement. Russia always has its own agreements. We will confirm this once again. Negotiations in the context of a special military. The stage of negotiations in the military. Thank you very much. I really need to run at this point. Your Residency, thank you very much for giving us so much time for your tremendous work.